To turn over the screen, the table, or whatever to Ling Fai for her introduction. Ling Fai, please unmute yourself and take it away.
Okay, hello everyone, and our guest speaker today is Georg Fischer, the Senior Research Associate at the Vienna Institute for International Economics Study, focused on employment and social policies at the European level. His last position was Director for Social Affairs in the Commission's Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. And he retired from the European Commission in July 2017. Earlier in his Commission career, Director Fischer contributed to establishment to the European employment strategy, worked on the green and white papers on pensions, on policies to facilitate labor market transitions, and more recent on policies to address social convergence and divergence. Previously to his work with the European Commission, Director Fischer worked at the Organization for Economics, Cooperation and Development, and served in the Ministry of Finance and Labor in Austria and at the Economic Cooperation Foundation in Tel Aviv. He was a research fellow at the Social Science Center Berlin and at the Yale University Macmillan Center. And now let's welcome our guest speakers for his speech today.
Ling Fai, thank you very much. And when I like to say Director Fischer has finished his presentation, then we will each have a very short opportunity when we ask our first question to say who we are and what we're studying at the University of Illinois. All right, I am going to share the screen for the presentation that Director Fischer has prepared for us.
Shall I start?
And I am turning the floor over to Director Fischer, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you and with this interesting audience coming from very far away. I'm actually at the moment in Berlin, not in Vienna. So we are in different places. I think both is in Vienna. And I think your students are probably distributed all over Illinois, I don't know. Anyway, so I'm speaking from Berlin, but I have a strong affiliation with Austria, with the Institute, and I'm also a Viennese, as I think. I understood that you are interested in the question, what can the EU actually do to implement policies? But before I comment on the different tools, I want to say something which is maybe a banality for all of you, but maybe not. I've learned that this is not always that clear. Therefore, I would like to say, what is the European Union? The European Union is a union of sovereign countries. It's not like the US, which is a federation. And this has not necessarily something to do with who is responsible for what. There's a difference between a union of sovereign countries and the federation of states like the US. But there are two important points. One point is, formally, the sovereign states have decided to transfer some of their powers to the EU. So to that extent, they have reduced their sovereignty, and the sovereignty is somewhere with the European Union. But the second point is, what have these states in common, or these countries? And they have obviously two very important facts in common, and that is that they have decided to produce and consume and work and fund and whatever, carry out their economic activities in a single market. That means that there is free movement of people, of capital, of goods and services, and there are more or less the same rules applying to economic activity across the Union. And the second point, which is getting more and more importance, is that 19 out of these 27 have decided to use the same currency, the euro. And using the same currency in an integrated single market means, of course, that countries are very much dependent on each other. So if you talk about climate change or about unemployment or whatever factor of economic or social life we think about, countries cannot anymore do as if they would exist on their own, because they are linked to each other. They depend on each other. If they want to change something on cars, they have to change it together. If they want to impose greenhouse gas emission targets, they have to do this together. But just think about a car. They have to decide how to deal with cars, and they have to decide to do it together. And the single currency, of course, has wider macroeconomic implications about which we can maybe talk later on, but that would now go too far. But let's just make this point. Therefore, it is important that the EU can agree policies, but also the EU must be able to implement policies. And I've listed here 3 different areas of competencies of the EU and member states. There are some areas where the EU has single power and single competence. The most obvious area is the monetary union. The euro is it's the currency for the euro area, and the body that administers this is the European Central Bank. Then similarly, we have trade and competition, where the EU powers are very strong and member states have actually very little freedom to act. And then there are many areas which are shared, and we have a wide variety of differences between those where the sharing is more on the EU side and the sharing is more on the member state side. And then there are many other areas where the EU has only a supportive role. And one issue now is that human health up to now was one of these areas where the EU had some rather limited competencies and possibilities to act. Could we move on? And now I come to the question which I think was the one which sort of was the starting point of the discussion. So what instruments the EU has? And I saw Bruce gave me a couple of questions you have raised, so which deal more or less all with different instruments the EU has. And there's legislation. The EU can legislate. And I come then what it means, the EU. There is the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament, but for the moment we have the Union. The Union can legislate. And there are 2 different legislative instruments which are binding, a regulation and the directive. And then there is a third legal instrument, a recommendation, which is not binding. And I've seen that some questions are raised on this recommendation tool. And then there is a parallel way of how the EU can influence national policies. That is policy coordination. And I don't know whether you have heard about this. There's the Stability and Growth Pact, which is all over the press and was for a long time all over the press. This is one area where the EU has strong policy coordination roles. The European semester, which is a broader tool of coordinating how member states carry out economic policies and to some extent also social policies or environmental policies. And then I've just picked out the greenhouse gas effort sharing regulation, which is another area where policy coordination is important. And then funding. So this is another instrument for the EU to influence national policies. Could we go on? Now I come to the actors. Now we have said the EU can legislate, the EU coordinates policies, but who is actually doing it? And you know that there are 3 main actors in the European Union, the European Commission, the Council of Ministers, and the European Parliament. And I come to the question which was raised before. who proposes legislation in the EU. This is an exclusive right of the Commission. And this is very different from the US. And therefore, I'm not surprised that not everybody knew this. This is something which is almost unique to the European Union, that the European Commission has a monopoly of proposing legislation. Neither the Council nor the European Parliament can start their own initiative for legislation. And this is also different from most member countries of the EU. Although in most member countries, it is much more common that the government actually proposes legislation than in the United States. So that's an important difference, which doesn't mean that Parliament and Council have no influence on what the Commission proposes. For example, in particular, the European Council, which is the Council of the leaders of the EU, the Council of the Prime Ministers and President. If the European Council tells the Commission propose an action on effort sharing in the greenhouse gas reduction area, the Commission is likely to do it. It's less clear for the Parliament. The European Parliament very often asks the Commission to do something, and the Commission has to think about it twice before it does it. But in principle, when the European Parliament really wants something to be done, usually the Commission will respond to it. But the decision to propose or not is an exclusive decision of the Commission. And I know that you have looked with Günther, at least I saw this in his PowerPoint presentation, you looked at the ordinary legislative procedure of the European Union, which involves a specific interaction between the three actors, the European Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. So I don't want to go into this. I just want to mention that national parliaments also have a role. But they are not directly involved because there is no space for national parliaments in the legislation process as such. But national parliaments can issue warnings, if you like. And they are called yellow and orange cards. And they will issue warnings when they feel that the EU is going too far, too much into their areas of competence. And that is something which you will occasionally hear for a legislative proposal by the Commission, that national parliaments say this goes too far, this is really not the business of the EU. And then we count the numbers of yellow and orange cards. And if they are higher than 3, I think the Commission is in troubles. But that it was now not to be quoted. This is recorded, but not quoted, what I just said. Another possibility to initiate, but there is no binding power of this, is that European citizens themselves can propose a legal act. But again, the Commission will decide whether it takes this up or not. Then there are consultative processes in the legislation process with the Committee of the Region and the Economic and Social Committee, and of course with the social partners, the European Trade Union Confederation and Business Europe for business. Could we move on? I want to spend just 2 minutes on this, because the area where, let's say, lobbies, NGOs, business, trade unions, also national governments, civil society, has the strongest impact on a legislative proposal will be before it is actually made. And this is when the Commission is preparing it. And the Commission is obliged to consult before it can launch, before it can propose. There are broad public consultations, there are targeted consultations. The Commission is even asked to do both if it is justified by the or necessary for a good proposal. This is the formal way to influence. So let's say a big environmental NGO will, of course, take a position in the public consultation and in the targeted consultation. But it's also the moment when lobbying takes place. People run around in Brussels like in Washington and try to convince members of parliament or staff in the commission that their view is the only one to look at something in the world. And therefore, there is a wide variety of lobby offices in Brussels, of industry, but honestly also of civil society. It's not just lobby offices of industry, but of course industry is very powerful and has a lot more money than NGOs, but they are there. And each government, of course, has a sort of embassy in Brussels, and they have hundreds of staff. And they will also influence. They will talk to commission officials. They will try to convince them that they should not do something, or they should do something, or they should, if they do it, they should do it this way. So this is a very important part of the process, how a proposal is actually shaped. And I just want to mention that there is a specificity of the EU, that the EU has actually committed itself to fund some of these lobbies, if you like. So for example, the EU supports financially the workers and business organizations at European level, but also the European Anti-Poverty Network, which something played a big role in my work, gets also some funding from the EU. But similarly on environmental issues, there are networks of national civil society organizations, and they will also get some funding for articulating themselves at EU level. I just say a proposal by the Commission needs to be accompanied by an impact assessment. And I mean, we can also go into this if you're interested, but it's a bit, maybe it goes too much into detail. Although it was one of my jobs to be a member of the so-called Impact Assessment Board, now Regulatory Scrutiny Board, which was it was one of the most interesting parts of my career in the Commission, to look at all these impact assessments of other policy areas. Of course, those which came out of my own policy area, I was not allowed to assess, but everything else I did assess. Can we move on? So now we come to the question, how can the Commission act? Let's assume the whole process took place. The Parliament and Council, the co-legislators, have adopted a legal act, or in policy coordination processes, the EU has agreed that to do something, not maybe made compulsory by a legal act. What can the Commission do to follow implementation? Of course, the first thing is help those who have to implement it, which is technical assistance. Then the EU can offer financial support. If something is difficult, like to run down your coal power stations, maybe financial support can help you to do this faster. But if we then come to the area where countries do not implement agreed standards, there is a term which I think you should have heard, which is the infringement procedure. This is particularly relevant where we have legislation. And we have two types of legislation. We have a regulation and a directive. A regulation creates legal rights and obligations in the document itself. By the way, also the treaty does this. So the legislative act is directly applicable in member states. And then there are directives where the legislative act needs to be transposed into national law. And this is an area where infringement can come up very quickly. Let's say the Council and Parliament agree a directive, and the directive says in 3 years countries have to transpose this into national law, and 5 countries don't do so. What will the Commission do? The Commission will launch an infringement procedure. equally likely is that member states might have transposed this, but insufficiently in view of the Commission. Again, the Commission will launch an infringement procedure. I don't really want to go, because that I could speak for half an hour about how these infringements are done. If it's a question of particular interest, I will explain it. In essence, of course, it doesn't start with a huge bang. It starts with a letter by the Commission to a country and say, what is happening there? And then they will respond. And then in the end, if no progress is made in all the friendly exchanges, or less and less friendly exchanges, this will be decided by the Court of Justice of the European Union. And the other point which is important is that the Commission is always obliged in directives and regulations to report about progress, which of course is another way to make sure that actually everybody knows which country has implemented more or less, or what is actually happening in implementation in a country. Should we continue? Now I want to say a few words about other areas of coordination, which might be relevant if you are interested in environmental and sustainability issues. The other way to coordinate, although it is sometimes overlapping with legal documents, is that member states say this is really an area where we should cooperate and we should have common policies. But these are not areas where you can simply adopt a law, where you can say the car standard is, and everybody has to produce cars according to a standard. Let's say it's about environmental policies in a broader way, or economic policies or social policies, where the main objective is to achieve a common good, but not necessarily each country in the same way. And what they typically do then is they agree on common objectives and translate them into European targets and national targets. And that, of course, works best if one can translate this into numbers like greenhouse gas reduction, emissions reductions, or unemployment rates, or deficits. Of course, if you have a number, the number might sometimes become more important than the policy objective behind it, like it certainly has happened with deficit targets. But I mean, it's an important point for policy purpose. Of course, if you have a number and then you have a policy process which agrees that you should achieve two numbers or one number or three numbers, that is the best of the world for EU policy coordination. If you have 50 numbers, the thing becomes much more complicated. And that is an important difference between different policy processes. When I see that there's a policy process in the EU which has 15 different targets, then you know that might not be that binding and not that be strong. So if one cannot narrow this down to 2-3 key objectives and 2-3 key targets, then of course it becomes very difficult to coordinate among 27 member states and the EU and Council and Parliament and Commission and so on. The process as such is quite heavy. Countries have to do reports on implementation, very often annual reports, not always. They have to present programs how they would like to implement their commitments, report back. Then the Commission will assess progress and report back, and under certain circumstances propose adjustments. And there, in addition, there's an addition European Union committees, which like the EFC, the Economic Policy Committee, the Employment Committee, and the Social Protection Committee, but there is also an Environmental Committee. So all these committees consist of representatives of member states, the Commission, sometimes also Parliament, but typically member states and the Commission. And they do all these review processes. So that's quite heavy procedures and heavy work. And the most typical example for this is the so-called European semester, of economic policy coordination. Can we go on? And then, of course, a lot depends how binding and strict such EU coordination processes should be. One way is to underpin such a coordination process with a regulation, like it is done in the greenhouse gas reduction efforts sharing regulation. So there the targets and tools are actually binding. And some of the economic policy guidance has also been drafted or put into regulations. Others are more declarations by Council or European Council endorsement. And then what happens if member states don't implement or don't achieve their targets? Let's say simply, maybe we have a regulation which only says you have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by X%, or you are not allowed to have a deficit higher than you, and so on. So what will the Commission do in areas where the EU wants this to be more committing and binding? Typically, the Commission will use this tool to say the country needs to implement corrective measures. And the member states then need to respond, and in the end, Council might decide, yes, country X has to implement corrective measures. And what happens if corrective measures are not implemented? Then we come to something which plays a big role in EU law, the idea of sanctions. And sanctions are in the EU almost always fines. And there I come back to the beginning. I mean, the EU has no executive powers in a member state. The EU cannot do it instead of a country. The EU has no tax machinery. The EU has little other machinery, certainly no machinery on national matters. So the EU needs to have a tool which is a sanction, but which can be imposed, if you like, rather easily, and these are financial fines. And by the way, the financial fines also play a big role in infringement procedures and also in the Stability and Growth Pact. Actually, fines are mostly used in infringement procedures. If a country really doesn't implement a directive or a part of a directive. Sanctions are rarely used in broader policy coordination processes, although they are very often discussed. I mean, if you have followed a little bit European press, there's always, the EU could impose a fine of 0.5% GDP. I don't think it has ever done it in another context than in infringement procedures. But how does it work then? It works because it focuses public attention. There's a debate in the country, there's a debate at the EU level, there's peer pressure. The other ministers in the council will tell the minister, come on, can't you move on? There will be opposition parties in the country which will use, of course, the Commission threatening with fines. And there is something which is maybe more problematic, in particular in the economic policy field, that actually financial markets will also respond to such situations. And that might be sometimes a more effective threat than other threats, but maybe the most problematic one. The last slide. I mentioned funding. I mean, funding is pretty simple. I mean, you buy the policy you want to have. It doesn't work always, I have to say. But there are basically many cases why funding is appropriate. One is because the EU is a very diverse body of countries. Richer, poorer, higher unemployment, lower unemployment, big environmental issues, smaller, more advanced, less advanced. And the key objective of the EU is to achieve cohesion or convergence. And for this purpose, the EU has quite a bit of money, the so-called cohesion funds, and they should help countries to advance towards a common pattern of, let's say, social progress, economic progress. The second reason is that economic integration is, of course, a wonderful thing. Everybody benefits, but there are also here and there occasionally losers, regionally, industries, and there will be losers in relation to a faster implementation of, for example, environmental targets. So the EU can actually help countries to move faster to economic circumstances which allow them to do so. So to address disruption or tensions resulting from economic integration. And one example is the original European Social Fund. Now the European Social Fund also has a very strong convergence dimension, but the original idea of the European Social Fund was to help regions which might lose out in establishing a more binding internal market. And then the third purpose is to achieve progress towards commonly agreed objectives, which could be convergence, then it would be under the first, but it can be very different objectives, including environmental objectives. And then we have two ways of funding. One way is the Commission funds directly. So I have a wonderful idea. The Commission makes a call for proposals. I say, I know how to solve this problem of the world, and the Commission gives me money for it. But the big money goes through a step in between. The money goes to countries, so-called shared management, for those who know a bit Commission language. The countries spend the money, but then the Commission and the EU has to make sure that the money is spent for the sort of things which are foreseen for the purpose of these programs. And that is then a very heavy exercise of programming. So Commission and national governments or national authorities will, for many months, sometimes years, negotiate the programs, what the money is spent for. And then the Commission can also, of course, monitor whether the agreed programs are actually implemented. Maybe I stop here. I just say, in my experience, the thing which works best is if funding and policy objectives are very clearly linked. And one example for me is, because you are young, the Youth Employment Guarantee, the Youth Guarantee and the Youth Employment Initiative. The Youth Guarantee was a council recommendation in which it said that young people should be offered employment training or education within 3 months of leaving school or getting unemployed. And the Youth Employment Initiative was a bunch of money on top of the European Social Fund to fund policies. And this combination actually worked quite well. I stop here and I'm curious to hear your questions.
Georg, thank you very much. Our goal now is to ask and answer 5 questions in roughly 15 minutes. And I would like to remind you that when you ask your questions, say who you are and what you're studying. And if you want to, also perhaps why you are interested in this project. Who would like to get us started? Please unmute yourself and take it away. Lane 5?
Yeah. Hello. Hi. I'm Ling Fei and I'm studying economics at the university, and I chose this program because I want to do some research about the environmental things. And I have a question about the funding. You say that the funding goes to different countries, right? How do we have a standard principle or evaluation things for like how these countries use these fundings and whether, if it's effective, like does it also influence in the future, like the funding will like still go to this country? Yeah, that's my questions. Thank you.
Does you want me to answer now or at the end? Hmm?
If you would, I'd like you to answer now. And
Okay. It's a very good question and it requires a long answer. When the EU programs the budget for 7 years, it has different principles how the money is distributed. One is economic activity. Richer countries get less than poorer countries. To say it very simple. But then, of course, this changes. And I think you are right in asking because this changes. The richer countries of yesterday might not be as rich anymore, the Southern European countries, for example, and the poorer countries of yesterday might not be as poor anymore. So these things have to change. And the second point is other aspects, like how big is, for example, the need to adjust your energy system, or your labor market situation will also have an impact on the distribution of the funds. But not always. It's not always rich and poor. It can also be some rich countries can be poor regions or regions with great difficulties. So they might also get money. So it's not always everything on country level. It can also be on regional level. But I think you also asked me another question on opinions. Was that you who asked this question in writing?
yes, Lingfei did ask a question.
I just want to answer very clear. Opinions are indeed opinions legally. An opinion by the Commission is an interpretation, if you like. There is a law which says, I don't know, cars should be designed in this way, and then there are many requests to the Commission, what does this actually mean? So the Commission will issue an opinion in which it will explain what this legal text means. That is not binding. You are right, this is not binding because it was not formally adopted by all the procedures how laws are adopted, but it clarifies, so that might be useful in itself. Not everything has to be binding to be useful, but it will also play a role in court proceedings. So if the European Court of Justice is asked to interpret a law and there is an opinion by the Commission, it will have the court is not bound to this opinion, but of course the court will say the Commission has said this and that, so it will certainly take account of it. I just wanted to answer this.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to question number 2. Anna?
Hi. Hi. So my name is Anna. I am a junior here studying global studies and political science, and I'm interested in this project because it really includes all of my interests academically and like professionally. And I guess my question is, like, in terms of like environmental policy, like which legislative like mechanism is typically done? Like, are they typically more binding or more, or are they like the binding mechanisms typically like passed, or the non-binding, considering like usually like the goals are very ambitious? So like if they don't achieve the goals, is there truly like anything that's like binding them to it?
That is a very good question. Honestly, but I can only give you my personal opinion. I think this is typically an area where the EU has to move from non-binding to binding. This is basically also what is happening now. There were binding legislative acts before, but I think this is clearly an area, if we want to achieve the famous 55% or zero cars or whatever, all this must be binding. because basically, as I said, we are in a single market. We have a common currency. You can't expect member states to do this only for themselves. They are too dependent on each other. Most of their trade is between them. The only way, I think, to make this work in an ambitious way, not when you say we have 100 years time, maybe you could do it non-binding. But if you really want to make progress, I think the more and more of these targets and commitments will need to be binding. And within the binding, they will need to be actually approachable through the Court of Justice with all the instruments which the EU has to implement, to force member states to implement. But that's my personal opinion. I mean, that's.
I want to say, Georg, that we started 2 weeks ago learning acronyms, and one of them was PIKE, which stood for the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. And it, at the global level, is thinking the same thing, that the clock is ticking and that it's necessary to achieve goals in a very finite time framework. And for that reason, it's necessary to move quickly from non-binding to binding. And that committee is doing that this year, presenting its recommendations in the end of this year in Glasgow at the next big global meeting on the Paris Accords. Let's go to the next question. Who is ready to raise a hand, unmute, and let it go? Reagan?
Yeah, hi. My name is Reagan. I am a senior this year at the university. I'm studying geography and GIS and urban planning, and my interests have mostly been in environmental planning. So yeah, and then as part of this project, one thing I'm looking at is the Just Transition Fund and the Just Transition Mechanism. And I noticed in your slides, you briefly mentioned those. And so I was curious more on what your thoughts are on this and how this fund and this mechanism relates to some of the legislative mechanisms that we've been talking about. Yeah, and what you think some of the strengths are of this fund. So yeah, I'm just curious on that vein.
I think my view, funding and the Just Transition Fund is in essence a funding instrument. Works then best when it's clearly linked to targets. And I must say, I haven't studied the design of the Just Transition Fund sufficiently to say whether this is the case. The risk, if it's not clearly linked to approachable and achievable targets, and the difficulty will be a 2035 target, is not good for a fund. I mean, you need to have a target for tomorrow and for the day after tomorrow. And so, the fund needs to show it works. No? And whether what you achieve in 2035 is very important, but you have to have much clearer steps in between. And that I don't know whether the Just Transition Funds or the provides for. That would be my maybe not very helpful answer. It's a good thing that they developed this system of programs and funds, and I think it follows basically this approach. You have an objective, you have targets, and you have funding, but you need to have a very clear link in order to make the use of the fund most efficient. Otherwise, I hope this is maybe recorded, but again, not quoted. You have a risk that member states will just say this is a wonderful project to promote economic transition towards less carbon and so on. But in reality, they will just present something which they would have done anyway. That's, if I cannot really see that this is additional and goes in the direction of the target and the objective, some of these fundings might not be that useful in relation to the objective. I mean, but for me to judge this, I can't, I think this well done by my ex-colleagues, so I'm sure that Just Transition Fund will help a lot. I mean, the other aspect of the Just Transition Fund is that it links social and environment, which is also very important. I mean, because in the end, I mean, you can have wonderful objectives and targets. If the people are not with you, then particularly if they happen to be Polish coal miners, I mean, you have a problem. So funding might also help on giving legitimacy to the projects.
Reagan, your question, I think, also combines with Ling Fai's question about achieving goals. And one thing that we will learn sooner than later is that the Commission does like to have reports from those that receive money indicating on an annual or periodically how much progress is being made on what the person or country entity given the money is doing to say that it will if it gets the money. And if it doesn't demonstrate that it is achieving its goals, then it won't get the money again. But the slippery part of that is that it's really necessary, and this has been something that the Commission has learned sometimes the hard way, that member states, for example, will say that they have done something and even provide graphs, tables, but it's not true. And it's really important to control the reliability of the information that those who receive funds, that they're providing reliable information. But I don't want to talk too much because Vikram hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet.
And I would like to answer all the questions Regan has asked in writing, but I do that shortly.
Hi, my name is Vikram. I'm a sustainability major, and I have one question for you. The question is on what circumstances are the EU member states exempted from a binding agreement?
None. I mean, the honest answer is none. I mean, unless the regulation or directive itself states there are exceptions, which can be the case.
Mm-hmm.
They are not, binding is binding.
Okay.
But you are right, this can be the case. And I just give you a simple example. As when Austria joined the European Union, it had some exceptions in the process of joining. I mean, for some years, it was still allowed to have some regulations on excluding foreigners from buying property. I mean, there are all these transitional provisions. And another famous transitional provision, very controversial, was when the Central and Eastern European countries joined the European Union. Several countries, including my own and Germany, asked for transitional provisions on free movement of workers. So they had 7 years time to not allow, not everybody, but some of the workers from Central and Eastern Europe to work in Austria or Germany, and in a couple of other countries as well. So these are transitional arrangements which can be there. And they are used in directives, in regulations, not that often, but for example, in the regulation on free movement of people, it was used. But otherwise, full exceptions, I'm not aware of. I don't want to say it cannot happen. Of course, it could happen. I mean, it could be in the text of the law to say this does not apply to, and that will certainly be the case to some small islands in the Atlantic or something. I mean, that I don't want to deny that such exemptions might exist.
What I have liked very much about this discussion is our returning again and again to the question about binding and really achieving goals, which I think for the EU Green Deal with the International Panel on Climate Change saying that we have to achieve certain goals in a finite time, otherwise it's just not going to work. So as we try to, as we continue our effort to look for best practices, I think it's important to keep in mind, as Director Fischer has told us, that the EU has succeeded often by talking and negotiating and reaching something like a common understanding. And that may, in fact, be a way to move forward with the provisions of the EU Green Deal. At the same time, we are probably going to consider the possibility that binding regulation will increasingly be necessary to make sure that things are done quickly. And there may be some kind of compromise between going the non-binding route and the binding route to try to maximize success. We only have 2 more minutes. I want to thank Director Fischer for sharing with us something that is very, very productive in our effort to try to learn what is most productive. I think, you know, the European Union does get quite a bit done. And we haven't heard in the last 50 minutes anything about gridlock, which is something that we experience so much in the United States. It could be that the European Union is better at avoiding gridlock than we are with our 2-party system in the United States. I ask us to think about that. At the same time, I know that Director Fischer often compares the United States and the European Union, and that he often sees things that happen in the United States as being very productive, very successful. So my last question to Director Fischer would be, if it were possible, if we come up with additional questions, if we might submit them to you and ask for your opinion.
Of course, with pleasure. I found the discussion very interesting. Thank you very much to all of you. Bruce, thank you very much for inviting me. Just one sentence to Regan's questions. I think your questions are all about the interaction between EU policy and courts. The whole EU system is based on the assumption that courts will force member states to act. It can be the European Court, it can be national courts. I mean, I can't go into it, but it's very important to see it's not only Commission and Parliament and Council. There are courts, the Court of Justice, but also national courts, and they should actually put pressure, I mean, like in the US. I mean, courts are very important. They're also very important in the EU. I mean, sorry, but I'm happy to answer questions in writing, absolutely.
Very, very good, thank you. And I know that you have another course, so I'm going to abruptly say, have a great course. Thank you very much, and we'll be back in touch very, very soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.